Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dialexicon podcast, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary issues at an easy to understand and digestible level. My name is Saurish and I'm your host. This week, we have with us Dr. Yarran Hominh, who is a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow with the Leslie Centers for Humanities and lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at Dartmouth College, and starting this fall, assistant professor of philosophy at Bard College. Hi, Dr. Hominh. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's a great, I guess, afternoon. Thank you for your time and for being here today. I wanted to just jump right in and ask you one of the, I don't know, to me the most interesting questions. How did you get into philosophy? Like, what stood out to you? There's always awesome stories to hear about guests, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about what you have in mind about, or I guess what stood out to you to philosophy.
Yeah, so I was always kind of interested in like ideas and cool things, and from a really young age, I like read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi when I was a kid, and so I guess just like being really interested in like other worlds and how they were put together and how they were different from ours, and kind of just like way in which the imagination could shed light on who we are and our place in the world. So I guess that was where I first kind of got into philosophy. I didn't really know it was philosophy. I would just be thinking about like, yeah, these just strange questions that would pop up into my head, like, why, why are things the way they are, and like, what is this world made of, and what am I doing here? So I guess there was kind of like, in Aristotle's Metaphysics, which is one of his works, he says that all people, he says all men, but I mean, he means all people desire to know, and that philosophy starts in wonder. That was kind of like one of the starting points for me when I was a really, I guess, yeah, when I was pretty young. Then I like read Nietzsche and stuff when I was in my early teens and kind of did like the philosophy bro thing for a bit. And I was like, yeah, man, like, what does Zarathustra mean and all that kind of stuff. Um, and then increasingly, I guess, as I went into high school and started university, I had a kind of different motivation, or developed a different motivation for doing philosophy, which was, I guess, to kind of like try and understand like, things that were happening to me and to other people, things that were kind of like painful or forms of suffering. So I wanted to figure out kind of like what my place in the world was in light of those kinds of experiences. Um, Bell Hooks, the Black feminist educator and philosopher and feminist theorist, she has this paper called Theory as Liberatory Practice, which is in a book called Teaching to Transgress. And she starts off that essay by saying something like, I'm paraphrasing, that, she writes, I came to theory because I was hurting. I came to theory because I wanted to make it stop. And theory was a way of liberation, a way of trying to deal with that pain and trying to understand it. So I guess there were those two motivations for me at different stages of my early life. That kind of traditional philosophy as wonder, trying to understand like cool things about the world, and then theory or philosophy as a form of dealing with suffering, trying to understand where that came from.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like this theory of like, I guess, suffering, I mean, I guess there's 2 points here, right? So the first is kind of understanding your place in the world, which I think is like every student, like
Yeah,
every
totally.
student's trying to figure out their place in the world. But also like you said, talked about kind of later about how going to theory as a way of like our understanding like suffering and understanding how it relates to other people as well. And I think that's like an important like point to address, because that kind of also can be a reason for why our topic today is about critical theory. But critical theory deals with those things, and it's also in application to a bunch of people. So I think that's like a really good setup to kind of get started into the discussion. So this pandemic, which definitely caused what Franco Berardi, who is a critical theorist, yeah, might denote as the halt, the big reset of the global machine, and that's a quote. We've seen a lot of racial violence being highlighted in media, and I'm curious to know whether there is a theory that can explain this violence in the context of capitalism. What is racial capitalism broadly speaking? And then can you also explain maybe the traditional differences that the economic capitalism, but as well as what we mean about it in critical theory and how it can translate to the social life as well?
Yeah, that's that last part of your question is really important. So let me say a few things about racial capitalism and the two parts of that term, that concept first, and then I'll move on to violence and that Franco Berardi quote, which is a really powerful one. So thanks for bringing that up. So yeah, racial capitalism, what is it? At its heart, it's a way of trying to understand and to theorize and to describe the interlocking nature of racism and capitalism. So that's what it's meant. I mean, it's kind of straightforward by racial capitalism. But what's important, I guess, is that there's not just one theory of racial capitalism. It's a whole school, a whole set of theories, and a whole lot of different ways in which different people try to understand the relation between race and racism on the one hand and capitalism on the other. So you mentioned that capitalism can be thought of as just an economic system or also as a social system. And most theorists of racial capitalism, as you suggested, treat capitalism not just as an economic system. And by that, I mean, for a quick gloss, we can think of capitalism just as a system of production and distribution of goods and services for profit. So, you sell goods, you sell services, people buy them, they trade them on the market, and, that generates wealth. So that would be capitalism as a purely economic system aimed at profit and the accumulation of wealth. But as you suggested, capitalism is also a social system that is a set of ways in which people come to relate to each other. So we can think here of the traditional Marxist distinction between the owners of the means of production and the workers, the proletariat. And workers are defined as people who have to sell their labor power. They have to literally sell themselves, their capacity to do things to other people in order to live. So for most of us, if we don't work, we literally can't afford food or rent or health insurance or all sorts of other things. So in that sense, we have to sell our capacity to work, our capacity to labor to someone else so that they can make a profit off of our labor power. So there's a relation there between those who own the means of production and those who work for those who own the means of production. But you can also think of other social relations. So investors versus those who reap investment, creditors and debtors, people who own property and people who rent property. So all these kinds of social relations are set up, also like customer and server, for instance. These social relations are set up also as part of capitalism. Further, capitalism, you could understand it as having a kind of cultural aspect. So there's the economic, there's the social, and there's the cultural. So by cultural, I mean something really loose, like a set of ways of thinking and feeling and seeing the world, kind of ways of understanding how we fit in with other people and with ourselves. So, people talk a lot these days about having to kind of create your brand. So if you have a brand, that's a kind of way of thinking of yourself in cultural terms, is having to kind of invest in yourself is another term that people hear. We have to be productive. You have to curate yourself so that others can consume what you produce on social media. You can also think of ways in which capitalism puts us in competition with one another. So we see each other as competitors and not, for example, as comrades. So these are kind of some of the cultural aspects of capitalism as a system, the ways in which it leads us to think and to feel about ourselves and others and see ourselves and others in different ways. So that's one part of the puzzle, capitalism. When you conjoin that with race to form racial capitalism, the idea is that that system of capitalism also constructs people as being racialized in particular ways, as being part of racial groups. And those groups, of course, are arranged in racial hierarchies. So what theorists of racial capitalism argue is that it's not like we have racism over here and capitalism over here. but that they're interlocked, they're interconnecting, they form one global system of racial capitalism. So if that's right, and I think that it is, then we can't understand either racism or capitalism just by themselves. So theorists of racial capitalism say, for example, that capitalism has always been racialized. By this, they mean the whole history of this global system of capitalism has been built on the racialization of different groups and the hierarchical racialization of different groups. So capital, the wealth that is accumulated by people so they can then reinvest it back in the system to create profit. So all the money and the resources and the equipment that people own, that other people work on, that was originally taken from the colonies, from Africa and Asia, from Latin America, from the Caribbean. And a lot of the people who worked on, that land and that resources, the people who were most easily exploitable, first the slaves and then the indentured servants, and then finally, in some sense, the free workers, they were from the darker races of the world. That's a phrase by Du Bois, from racialized groups. So Eric Williams, for example, a famous Black Marxist, argues that capitalism was built on slavery. And other racial capitalists, theories of racial capitalism, make the same kinds of argument, that capitalism has been racialized since its inception. So that's the idea that racism is kind of essential to the functioning of capitalism, that we, signify other groups of people as being lower in the racial hierarchy. That enables, let's just say whites, to exploit those people more easily, to extract their land, to accumulate on their behalf, because they are lower in the racial hierarchy than you. So racism eases, enables, facilitates the process of accumulation of capital.
Yeah, I mean that like, I guess kind of correlating those two makes a lot of sense, because I think oftentimes we treat these two things as separate, when there's definitely, I mean, a theory at least, and there's definitely an understanding how they could be interlocked, right? And we see that even, I think, during the pandemic, there was like a study, I think, or not a study, but maybe like an article that was published, I think in LA Times, where it was like, Black Americans disproportionately have access to vaccines, and all of those things that are related to kind of health and those things. And there was an article about racial capitalism and how it constructs those things to racialized bodies, as opposed to maybe those who are in higher positions, right? And so it's a combination of both, capital having like the bourgeoisie and like the proletariat, but also kind of understanding how those things can play out with racialization, and how those things are connected. So there's really, really interesting. And I think for anyone who's listening who maybe wants to read a little bit more, I think there's this great paper by Nancy Leung called literally Racial Capitalism. I think it was published in maybe 2013. And then obviously the Cedric Robinson has the Black Marxism book with a foreword by, I believe, Robin Kelly, I believe that's their name.
Yeah,
Robin Kelly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's like some great texts to read, and we're going to talk next about kind of Du Bois and kind of like what he was talking about. But before, I want to step back a little bit, because you did mention that capitalism can make people feel like they're competitors.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, how could that potentially be true in the school system, where students are meant to kind of collaborate with each other, right? But and that's kind of how we're supposed to get together, and like, you graduate as a class, you don't graduate individually. But how can this like method of competition be, I guess, toxic in a way for students?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like competition between students, at least in universities and colleges where I've been teaching, I'm sure it's the same in high school and middle school, has increased a lot in the last 15, 20 years since I went through school. I mean, obviously it was there when I went through school in a different context in Australia. But yeah, I think there's been a huge increase in that. And I see that in my students and in the other people with whom I talk on campus. But yeah, let's think about why that's the case. So, we have this idea that school and education more broadly is to prepare you for the workplace, right? It's meant to give you skills so that you can be gainfully employed, so that you can be a good citizen, you can contribute to society, you can be productive. So that's what education is meant to do. But at the end, there are, only so few jobs that are there. We know it's increasingly hard to find work which is fulfilling, work which is satisfying. And with the amount of debt that people are accumulating to go through school, to get their education, they want some kind of, upshot at the end of it. They want to feel that it's been worth it for them. So, because there are so few good jobs at the end, you have a finite supply of goods. And there are so many people coming through the pipeline. Of course, the competition that exists at the end point is going to kind of feed back through the rest of the system. And that's what you get when you have a system of education which is designed and aimed at producing people who are ready for work. Now, of course, education ideally, and I think education still in many places does, have other goals. Education is not just for the purposes of getting you a job. It's not just for the purposes of employment. It's for all sorts of purposes, including just personal, intellectual and personal moral and ethical growth. And if we focus on those purposes, I think we would have a very different education system. But unfortunately, I think the entire education system is increasingly directed towards job readiness in a way which really undermines the process of education.
Yeah, and I think that's like really evident, especially like in the past few years with like the pandemic and what happened in terms of schooling. Like I think it's just pretty clear that like that's kind of a way that capitalism impacts education even. So really it's impacting a lot of vectors that impact your life on an everyday basis. But now going back to, the question that I had about Du Bois and his conception of moral psychology of racial capitalism, how does that affect us? Well, first of all, can you explain what that is? And then also, how does that affect us who are, maybe the proletariat, who we presumably believe to be like the proletariat who are working for like selling their labor almost?
Yeah, so this term moral psychology is a strange one. I want to spend a bit of time unpacking that. So again, there's two parts to it. There's psychology and there's the moral part. So psychology, has to do with the ways in which people think and feel. By moral psychology, I mean that word moral in two senses. So the first sense is this old meaning of moral from the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, where moral meant kind of pertaining to the whole human being. So in Cambridge, in the Cambridge University in the UK, they have a club called the Moral Sciences Club. It's one of the philosophy clubs where they give talks about morality and ethics and political philosophy and so on. The moral sciences were all of the ways in which we gained knowledge about the human being as a whole. So moral there means the human being as a whole, not just, I guess, the brain or, rationality or neuroscience. So you can study psychology in a much narrower sense, but moral psychology is pertaining to the whole human being. Insofar as moral psychology pertains to the whole human being and not just like the narrow sense of like scientific psychology, then it's not just descriptive. It doesn't just purport to help us understand, the kind of causal mechanisms of implicit bias or how normal childhood intellectual development between the ages of 3 and 5 happens. Those are kind of like descriptive psychological questions. But moral psychology is normative, it's evaluative. It has to do with how our ways of thinking and feeling express values, how they're subject to normative evaluation. The way that I use the term, because morality is part of society, we inherit our ways of thinking and feeling from society. Moral psychology is also, in that sense, social, it's political. So it's about how society and politics shapes the ways in which we think and feel, including the values that we have, the kind of goals that we have, and how we seek to achieve them. So that's kind of what I mean by moral psychology, just in the background. Du Bois thinks that racial capitalism, the whole system that we spoke about earlier, shapes those ways of thinking and feeling, shapes the values that we have in particular ways. And it shapes those ways of thinking and feeling so that we kind of come to participate more fully in the system. We become part of the system. It shapes us in their image. In particular, and I'm drawing here on two books mostly of his. The first is Dark Water, which is from 1920. It's written just after the First World War. It's a huge indictment of the kind of like political and social and psychological processes that led up to the First World War. And the second is his second autobiography. It's called Dusk of Dawn. And again, it's kind of connecting politics and moral psychology. So in both of those books, among other things, Du Bois examines this idea of whiteness. And he says whiteness is a kind of way of thinking and feeling, a kind of orientation to the world, how we see ourselves in the world in relation to other people. So the late and very wonderful Black philosopher Charles Mills, he describes this as seeing whitely, like seeing in a white way. So what does Du Bois say about whiteness? The first thing to recognize is that by whiteness and by white, he doesn't just mean like the color of someone's skin. He means that moral psychology, the kinds of significances and meanings and ways of thinking and feeling that come along, that get attached to different skin colors. So Du Bois says that whiteness is attributed a kind of ownership. Whiteness is a form of ownership. He says ownership of the world forever and ever. Amen. That's from Souls of White Folk in Darkwater. So this notion of ownership and whiteness, if you put them together, whiteness has to do with race and ownership has to do with capitalism. So in that equation of whiteness and ownership, Du Bois is connecting race and capitalism. So he proposes that when you see the world in a white way, you see the world in terms of ownership, in terms of the power that you have, the entitlement that white people have, people with a certain skin color, have over things in the world. They're entitled to own them and to exclude other people from using them. So this manifests in a couple of like fundamental, like basic ways of understanding oneself and the world that are kind of capitalist ways of understanding oneself and the world. We can capture them in a couple of slogans. So the first is that more is better. To have more things is better because the more you own, the kind of like bigger you are, the more expansive you are. And the second is that life is a form of competition. It's a zero-sum game. And that means that for every gain that you have, someone else has to lose. And so we're always set in a kind of competition. So he says of the European powers, the imperialist powers at the end of the 19th century, that they wanted to divide the world up amongst themselves and they fought with each other about Africa and about Asia and about Latin America. And that was the main cause of the First World War. The great powers kind of battling each other to see who could own more of the world. So this manifests in like, this is going to be a very long answer. I'm sorry, I'll try and cut it a bit short because it's a very complex issue. But he thinks that this kind of idea of whiteness as ownership manifests at the surface level of the ways in which we think and feel in a bunch of different emotions and attitudes. So if you think you own everything, then you'll be angry at others who threaten the things that you own. So you can think of white anger here against Black people and Latinos and Asians, especially during the pandemic, right? The threat that immigrants pose to our way of life. If you think that you own everything, then you will feel some kind of like disgust at people who don't own anything, the beggar in the street, right? You'll also kind of have pity for them. You might think that, you know, you have sympathy for them, so you'll give them some charity. But if they don't respond in the right way by being grateful for your charity, then you'll resent that, you'll be indignant. So he describes these complicated relations between these emotional attitudes that we have insofar as we inherit, and he thinks we all inherit in different ways, not just white people with white skin, insofar as we inherit this white way of thinking.
So do you think that like maybe this could be a reason for why, I guess, like microaggressions exist in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Du Bois, throughout his career, changes the way in which or develops the way in which he thinks this whiteness kind of manifests. In his more mature phase, he thinks that whiteness manifests also kind of like unconsciously in these habits of mind, in these folk ways, he says. And so you could think of microaggressions as one kind of like subconscious or unconscious manifestation of these white ways of thinking. these kind of like automatic habits that we pick up just by living in a majority white society.
So in that case, then like, why is it important for us to understand these concepts? Like, let's say I identify these things and say maybe it's because of like what we're picking up in like a white society, but how does that change the way we talk, interact, or make our decisions? Like, when does it become more than a theory for us to understand and adopt to kind of maybe change our lifestyle in a way? Like, what did he have in mind for a way to kind of ameliorate that crisis in a way?
Yeah, so Du Bois thought that the response, not the solution, but the response to racial capitalism had to occur on a number of levels. So the highest level is what we kind of in philosophy and in the humanities and social sciences call structural change. So we need to change the kind of social and economic systems that govern our lives. We have to like transform capitalism. We have to reclaim democracy. So we have to change the kind of political and social structures that exist. But that's not enough. He thinks that we also have to change the ways in which we relate to each other, the kind of social level that sits below that kind of structural level. And then below that, he thinks that we have to change the ways in which we think about ourselves and others, the ways in which we feel, the ways in which we, kind of like subconsciously like express, because that kind of like psychological level reflects the higher structural and social levels. So when does this, like, where does this hit the road? Yeah, it's a big question, but Du Bois thinks it has to hit at all of those levels. So if I can put that into a slogan, if we need to criticize the political and social structures, we need to protest them, we need to imagine possible changes that can occur with them. To achieve those changes, we need to build collective action, right? We need to get together, we need to take to the streets, we need to change our schools, we need to, like claim back self-determination to direct things differently from how they're going at the moment. And to do that, that also involves changing the ways in which we think and feel and realizing how those ways have been shaped by those social structures. So all those changes at different levels kind of can support each other.
So it seems that like there's not just a mindset shift, but almost like a shift at every single vector that impacts your life, right? Like it's like changing the social structure, changing your education, changing the way you protest, or maybe the way you organize, all of those things all collectively come up, and then there's like this potential to kind of ameliorate that crisis in a way. And I think it can probably be ameliorated even if not all of those things come together, right? Like definitely each step is always going to be beneficial, but I think that kind of makes sense. It does seem like
It's a
really
lot.
hard to do, but like
Yeah.
again, it's definitely like it definitely makes sense in how it would happen. It just given how like society is constructed, it seems almost not, I wouldn't say impossible. It seems very, very difficult to even get to that level. But I want to kind of shift the conversation now to kind of to your projects, right? Specifically, you have this book that you're currently writing called "The Problem of Unfreedom." What is this book meant to highlight? What is the unfree? Who are the unfree? And how can the unfree free themselves?
I mean, you just kind of described the project of the book in that last kind of riff on the question that you had. But I'll try and put it in my own words. So let me say something first about unfreedom and then about the problem of unfreedom. So why use the term unfreedom? Like, is that even a word, right? So I guess like a lot of people want to talk about freedom, like we always, like America is the land of the free, freedom is the goal that everyone aims at. Freedom is what inspires all sorts of kinds of political action and collective movements. And so people always, in philosophy too, we center this idea of freedom. There's endless debates, intellectual debates about the different kinds of freedom and what their flaws are and how they relate to each other. So by starting with unfreedom, I want to kind of like skip all that because I feel like there's all these debates that are going on, but if you kind of like look around, unfreedom is where we are. We have a kind of like unfreedom is more familiar to us than freedom. We know it much better than freedom. Freedom's all the way up there. We don't really know what it looks like. But if we kind of focus on our current situation, then I think we realize we have a better grasp of unfreedom. So some examples of unfreedom, we've been through them, like debt. lack of jobs, difficulty in making ends meet, um, increasing barriers to abortion, the fact that democratic processes don't seem to work, expectations of upward mobility and like particular kinds of lives that you have to live. So all these are kinds of forms of unfreedom that we're very familiar with. So we can think of unfreedom as any kind of constraint on agency or any kind of impoverishment of our capacities for agency, our ways of thinking and feeling and acting in the world. So that's unfreedom. The problem of unfreedom is, as I said, what you just talked about. I'll put it like this. If we're unfree because of the social and political conditions in which we live, and we're therefore motivated to change those conditions to become freer, the problem is that changing the conditions requires exercising freedom. And so it seems like we have to be free in order to become free. And that's the difficulty that you adverted to earlier, the perhaps impossibility that our unfreedom is that which kind of saps our agency, saps our capacities to make change. But we want to change that very situation. So how do we kind of get out of this vicious cycle? So can those who are unfree, which I think is all of us under these systems of racism and capitalism and so on, can those who are unfree free themselves? That's the problem of unfreedom.
That's an interesting question to kind of like explore. And honestly, it sounds really difficult to answer.
Yeah, it is.
Because
Your
I
guess
think
is
you're
as
right.
good as
Like,
mine.
yeah, because like I think like if you are in a position to like protest and all things, to a certain extent, you are kind of free. Because if you're not, if you're able to do that, then you at least have certain things that you have under control, to which you're in the position where you're able to go out and protest. Certain people might not even have that ability. So in those cases, then you're completely unfree, right? Like you are literally not able to do the things that could make you free in the first place. So it seems like a difficult question. And in it, you kind of mentioned that like the problem of freedom is a practical one to be resolved by action. What does that mean? Like, how do we know what action there is? How do we commit that action? Especially, like I just like talked about, if you're unfree, like how are you even supposed to get to that action? How do you even know that action?
Yeah. So I don't think that there is a kind of foolproof way to know what to do. I don't think there's a recipe or a plan that takes us from unfreedom to freedom. That's in no small part because there are different kinds of unfreedom. And obviously they interrelate in different ways, like we spoke about with racial capitalism. But one person or one group's unfreedom might not be that of another's. So it's a practical one to be resolved by action, just in the sense that we can't think our way out of this problem. We can't say, well, here's the problem. If we just study it hard enough, we'll get this recipe that will take us from A to B. Rather, we have to, as you said, engage in these practical political forms of action so that we can actually learn what works, what possibilities there are. We can learn the people who can support us. We can learn about their situation, compare it to ours. So practice, action, is a kind of way of learning more about our situation and of developing and creating new imaginative possibilities. So that's just, yeah, we can't really know what the action is, except like by getting out there and kind of doing it, by protesting, by talking to other people, by challenging the structures of power that are around you and learning how they work, how they might be changed, how you might gain power with other people, and together work to kind of change the system. How do we commit to that action is a really interesting question. You spoke earlier about like impossibility and difficulty. And I think there's a real challenge there, which is kind of like a pessimism. Like it can just be so overwhelming. How do we even get started on this? That's one reason why a lot of social movements emphasize hope. Like having, and the way that I want to think of hope is not like hope for some goal, but hope in the powers of other people and in yourself, that if you continue working together, continue building alliances, continue figuring out and kind of like, changing small things, then together we might be able to make the kind of larger change that we're looking for. So that's kind of what I like. Hope can be an antidote to pessimism. So that's
Yeah,
one
and I
way to
think
commit.
And I think like just on this topic of pessimism, which unfortunately seems to be a route that a lot of I guess like kids part of the younger generation are going through right now, just because of the responses, right? Like, I think like let's go to like recent events, right? And like this is something that's really hot in America right now about gun violence, right?
Mhm.
Like school shootings are have happened quite like a lot, right? Like there's more shootings, I think, mass shootings in America than there have been days in the year, which says a lot, right? But the fact that there is still such a big like there's still like not much happening. Like for example, I think Texas had like a ban on drag queens but not a ban on any guns or anything
Yeah.
right after that. Like that kind of shows that there's not being a lot of like a lot our voices aren't being heard as much, and that's kind of like I think a general like theme for a lot of
Mhm.
younger students is that like our voices just aren't being heard, right? Like I had a discussion with Dr. Ian Tully from Johns Hopkins on depression, and the pandemic had a huge impact on students on over mental health, and still there's not really much being done there. It's kind of like I guess the government's kind of like sweeping it underneath the rug as if that never happened, right? Just get them back in school, everything will be fine. But it's kind of like ignoring what had happened, right? And that kind of seems to be the trend. So I'm interested in knowing kind of why you think that like this hope, right, or like this constant chase of hope can be beneficial, especially for students. I think this could be really beneficial for students because training pessimism is probably not the greatest thing to do at an early age, right? Maybe as like if you get older and you start seeing, then maybe you experiment and see that pessimism, but training it at a young age seems counterintuitive almost. So like what do you think about hope in general?
I mean, to be honest, I'm torn on hope. For all that I just said about how important it is, I think sometimes it can be wholly misleading. It can also be put to really bad purposes. So many of our hopes are highly individualized. Like we hope to get a good job one day, we hope to get into a good college, and those sorts of hopes just serve to prop up the system. So that's just to say that hope can be dangerous as well as, like inspiring. On the side of pessimism, you put it really well. I think pessimism is, in a sense, rational. It's like the right response to have to everything that's going on in the world. So I don't want to discount pessimism. I think it has to be confronted. The great theologian and philosopher, American philosopher, Reinhold Niebuhr, he was early, like mid 20th century philosopher. He said that every philosophy worth its salt, I can't remember what phrase he used, every worthwhile philosophy is a confrontation with pessimism. And I think there's something right about that. So that's just to put hope and pessimism in context. I think what hope in other people can do is it can focus you on the small kinds of actions that you can take with the people that are around you. So in your schools, even if your teachers and the principal and those who are like running the school, so to speak, aren't going to listen to your voice, aren't going to cede to your demands, you can do things yourself without having to go through them. You can create your own reading groups after school. You can build connections between members of your community, including the school community, and advocate in that way. So a lot of the pessimism that you spoke about comes because we see ourselves as having this voice, we down here, and the decision makers are up there, the politicians and the administrators. And all we can do is like ask them for stuff, and put pressure on them. It's always like just yelling upwards. But there are things that we can do right here and now to build connections between people in communities that actually have effects on people's lives. And those are the kinds of small steps that I think can work towards the bigger changes that we want to see. So, the congressman, the Black congressman and civil rights activist, John Lewis, he said that freedom is the continuous action that we all must take. It's not just talking about representatives or talking about what can happen, but it's about building community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great quote and kind of like summarizes like most of like what we've been talking about like previously, like or just right now, I guess. And I guess like this kind of segments into because we're talking about agency and kind of promoting your agency and activism as a whole. Like, how can learning about critical theory and maybe just racial capitalism in general, but also
Mm.
broadly critical theory, and its philosophy be really beneficial to students, like high school grad students, anyone really.
Yeah, I want to go back to that quote by bell hooks with which I started, 40 minutes ago. That theory can be a form of healing, a form of liberation. So critical theory, or any kind of philosophy, but particularly philosophy and theory that's critical of our social world. That's all I mean by critical theory. Kind of like delving deep into where we came from, where we might go, what the sources of our problems are, what the shape of those problems are, trying to understand where our sufferings and those of others come from. That can be like in itself a form of healing. It can help us just kind of like cope with, what might otherwise seem to be hugely overwhelming. Um, Going back to Du Bois and those levels at which action has to happen. If critical theory is criticism of society as a whole, but it's also learning kind of where we came from and where the ways in which we think and feel come from, then social criticism is at the same time a kind of self-knowledge. And self-knowledge, I mean, there's a long tradition in the Western tradition, philosophical tradition, of self-knowledge being a form of the good, right? A form of something important to people. So connecting social criticism and self-knowledge, as critical theory does, I think that can be really beneficial for students too.
So, because we just talked about like how it can be beneficial, why do you think then that critical theory has been banned in a lot of states? Right, like it's, I was also shocked when this happened, but like, what are the precedents that it sets, and what are some potential problems of banning it, and what could be some potential reasons for it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have anything too original to say here. I mean, it is a travesty that that states and other governmental and administrative bodies think that it could ever be good in the name of like freedom to like ban something from being discussed. And we know that it's purely political. We know that it's meant just to, foster a kind of docile, uncritical appreciation of like the greatness of this country. It's built. It's just an acknowledgement that this country is, in a sense, built on a deep lie. And unless we can reconcile with that lie, come to understand it, it's going to be there. It's never going to be fixed. So I've got nothing really, too exciting to say about that, except to note that it is a form of the problem of unfreedom. Because banning critical theory is a way of further constraining people's agency such that they can't then challenge the systems that constrain their agency. So again, it's that kind of vicious circle. What else can I say? I mean, here's a very small, although I think important point. There's this term, and it's a very fancy term, called the proletarianization of the professional class. So the professional classes, lawyers, doctors, teachers, they've traditionally been self-regulating. Society has trusted them to develop their own standards and to regulate their own behavior. And that's been really important to a functioning society, because when, we don't trust those people in those jobs to perform their jobs properly, who else is going to regulate them? Like the state. The state doesn't know anything about medicine or teaching. We should leave it to the experts. And so there's a real decrease in trust that comes about, a turning of those professional classes, which have been historically self-regulating, into people who just work for the owners of capital. So now if you're a doctor, you just work for someone else. If you're a nurse, you work for someone else. If you're a teacher, you work for someone else. And that is not the way in which those classes, those particular groups of people have historically governed themselves.
Yeah, and I think this is a little bit sidetracked, but I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is that the ways in which politicians have all of these people working underneath them, but still may not actually use them in their decisions. So, for example, I think the biggest one is probably climate change. So much research has been done in climate change, yet we still have, politicians going around saying that it's a hoax, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing happened with COVID. So, like, it's just interesting to see kind of that, again, proletariat democratization of the professional class, and how that kind of is kind of terrible. But like, to wrap this up and like this entire podcast up, I wanted to ask you what you're doing now and what your research is focused on now, so that people who are listening, our audience, if they're interested in reaching, or like, I guess, reading more, what are you doing now and what's your main research focus?
Yeah, I mean, we've just kind of talked about it. So I'm writing this book on the problem of unfreedom. I don't know when that will be published, but that's my main task now, to write this book. I published a recent short public philosophy piece on unfreedom for a magazine called The Philosopher magazine. It's a UK-based magazine, but it's available online. Perhaps I will send you a link, Saurish, to that afterwards, and you can put it up on the podcast or whatever. I've also written some other academic papers about moral psychology and politics and the way they connect together. So I'll just really quickly list a couple of them. They've got to do with themes that we've been talking about. One of them is about what it means to blame the system. So, we want to blame the system. The system's totally broken, but what is it to blame the system? Because the system isn't a person. It's not going to respond in the same way to blame. It's not even an agent that we can kind of blame for having done something wrong. So what are people, in particular activists, trying to do when they ask people to blame the system? I'm thinking also about distrust, and we spoke about distrust and hope, and how some of those moral emotions can play political roles directed towards political and social transformation. So that's kind of where my research is. It's about the connection between politics and social philosophy, and the ways in which we think and feel, moral psychology.
Definitely. I think those are like really, really cool questions to explore. Like, I think you can really be drawn into that and captivated for a very, very long time. There's endless amount of questions that you can explore
That's
here.
true. Yeah.
And they're all really, really relevant, right? Um, so yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for joining today, and like your time today. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. And it's really important to recognize that a lot of the philosophers that you mentioned aren't even like what you would consider like current day philosophers, but their work is still really impactful, and that just goes to show the power of philosophy, and how it transcends even time, really. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for your time, and for the entire discussion.
Yeah, thank you for organizing this, Sarish. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.